You missed the whole damn target, old man. The laughter came fast and sharp across the firing line, cutting through the dry Nevada wind like shattered glass. Marines lowered their spotting scopes, some grinning openly now, others shaking their heads in disbelief as the echo of the rifle shot disappeared into the distant canyon walls. At nearly 1,900 yards, the steel silhouette still stood untouched beneath the blazing afternoon sun. No ring of impact, no dust kick, no movement, just silence beyond the range. Dean Callahan slowly lowered the old M40 rifle from his shoulder. The worn leather sling creaked softly against his faded field jacket as brass rolled across the concrete firing pad beside his boots. He said nothing. Around him, the younger Marines fed off each other's amusement. Lance Corporal Tyler Quinn leaned back from his spotting optic with a smirk stretched wide across his face. That round wasn't even close, he laughed. I think it landed somewhere in Arizona. A few of the others burst out laughing harder at that. One of them pulled out a phone, already recording. The old man didn't react. He simply stood there with the rifle resting calmly in his hands, pale blue eyes fixed far beyond the steel target, swaying in the heat haze. Above the canyon ridge, the range flag snapped violently in one direction while the dry grass below moved in another. Dean noticed it instantly. Nobody else did. Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer stepped forward from behind the firing benches, arms crossed tight over his chest. At 34 years old, Mercer carried himself with the clean confidence of a man who trusted numbers more than instinct. A ballistic tablet hung from his vest beside a laser rangefinder worth more than the pickup truck Dean had driven onto base that morning. Mercer glanced toward the untouched steel silhouette almost a mile away, then back toward the old veteran standing quietly at the line. Target untouched, he announced flatly. No impact. More chuckles spread through the firing range. Tyler Quinn grinned wider now, emboldened by the audience around him. Guess they did things different back in Vietnam, he said loudly. Maybe targets were bigger back then. Another Marine snorted beside him. Or closer. The laughter rolled again. Dean finally moved, but only slightly. He reached down and worked the bolt of the old M40 with slow mechanical precision. The sound was smooth, worn, familiar. The rifle looked ancient beside the sleek modern sniper systems lined across the benches nearby. Carbon fiber stocks, suppressors, digital optics. Everything black, modular, expensive. Dean's rifle looked like something pulled from a museum. The walnut stock carried deep scratches darkened by age and oil. Near the bolt housing, a long gouge cut through the wood like an old scar. Tyler noticed it immediately. Damn, he laughed. That thing survived the Civil War too? Some of the younger Marines leaned closer, grinning at the battered rifle. Dean ignored every word. He lifted his eyes toward the canyon again instead, studying the movement of the mirage shimmering above the rocks nearly halfway to the target. Heat drifted left to right at one elevation. The dust lower in the ravine moved the opposite way. Triple wind layers, hidden currents, complicated air, the kind modern computers struggled to predict. Mercer sighed impatiently. Sir, he said, his voice colder now, we're conducting active sniper qualifications here. If you're done, clear the line for the next shooter. Dean rested one hand gently across the worn rifle stock. The desert wind tugged softly at his gray hair. Somewhere far above the range, the faint hum of a helicopter drifted across the empty sky. Then, without taking his eyes off the distant target, Dean spoke quietly. You boys keep reading the flags, he said. But the wine down there stopped telling the truth about 15 minutes ago. The firing line went still for half a second. Then Tyler Quinn laughed harder than anyone. Tyler Quinn wiped tears from his eyes as the laughter finally began to settle across the firing line. The younger Marines crowded around the spotting scopes again, still grinning, still throwing comments back and forth while the desert heat shimmered over the canyon like waves rising from a furnace. Brass shells glittered beneath their boots. Dust drifted lazily through the afternoon air. Dean Callahan remained exactly where he stood, calm and unmoving beside the old rifle. Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer watched him carefully now. Something about the old man's stillness had started to irritate him more than the missed shot itself. Most civilians got embarrassed under pressure. They made excuses. They blamed equipment or wind or age. Dean did none of that. He simply kept staring downrange as though the target still mattered. Mercer stepped closer, gravel crunching under his boots. "You were saying the target setup is wrong?" he asked. Dean shook his head once. "No," his voice came low and rough like distant thunder over dry ground. "I am saying your boys trust computers too much." Tyler smirked from behind his rifle bench. "Computers hit targets," he called out. Whatever that was did not. More laughter followed, thinner this time. Dean slowly crouched beside the M40 and ran one weathered hand along the walnut stock. His fingers paused briefly over the deep gouge cut near the bolt assembly. The mark looked old. Not damage from neglect. Something else. Something carried for a long time. One of the younger Marines leaned forward curiously. "What even happened to that thing?" he asked. Tyler answered before Dean could speak. "Probably dropped it during Woodstock." A few chuckles rolled across the line again. Dean ignored them all. The wind shifted harder through the canyon below, rattling the range flags mounted beside the firing berm. But lower along the ravine, the tall dry grass moved differently. Dean noticed it immediately. Mercer did not. Neither did anyone else. The staff sergeant folded his arms tighter. "Look," he said, forcing patience into his voice. "These Marines are training for precision engagements at extended distances. We use verified data here. We use measured adjustments. This is not guesswork anymore." Dean finally looked at him. Pale blue eyes, clear despite the decades behind them. "Wind has never cared about data," he said quietly. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Something about the old man's tone landed strangely against the noise of the firing range. It was not defensive. It was not angry. It sounded like experience talking to memory. Tyler Quinn broke the silence with another laugh. "You hear this?" he called to the others. "Next thing he is going to tell us bullets can curve around corners." Several Marines grinned again, though weaker now. Dean stood slowly, joints stiff but controlled. He picked up the rifle with practiced ease and looked back toward the steel silhouette nearly 1,900 yards away. Heat waves danced violently between the canyon walls, twisting the target into a blurry gray shape. Dean narrowed his eyes slightly. Then he spoke without turning around. "Who is your best shooter?" Tyler immediately stepped forward. "That would be me." Dean nodded once. "Then move the target." Tyler frowned. "Move it where?" "Smaller plate," Dean said. "Farther back. 2,000 yards." The firing line went quiet. Even Mercer blinked at that. 2,000 yards pushed beyond normal qualification distance. The canyon winds alone made it miserable. Tyler let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You cannot even hit the first one." Dean rested the old M40 against his shoulder again. "You boys are aiming where the target is," he said softly. "Not where the air moves." Mercer stared at him for a long second, then finally exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he muttered. "Set up the 2,000-yard plate." Tyler grinned immediately, sensing another public humiliation coming. Around them, Marines started moving downrange equipment while the dry Nevada wind screamed harder through the canyon walls. Dean simply watched the grass below the ridge line bend in 3 different directions at once. The new steel plate stood barely visible against the canyon wall, nearly 2,000 yards away, a dull gray square trembling inside waves of rising heat. Marines moved back from the firing line one by one, their earlier laughter fading into restless anticipation as the afternoon sun baked the range into shimmering layers of dust and light. Tyler Quinn settled behind his scoped rifle first, eager now. Competitive. The old veteran had challenged the line, and Tyler intended to bury him with numbers. "Watch this," he muttered confidently as he loaded a round. Into the chamber. His rifle looked like something designed for another planet beside Dean Callahan's worn M40. Carbon fiber chassis. Precision bipod. Suppressor. Digital range data glowing softly across a mounted ballistic screen. Everything about it screamed modern perfection. Tyler steadied his breathing and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked sharply across the canyon. Marines immediately leaned into spotting scopes, searching through the heat distortion. A second later, a spotter called out, "Mississippi low left." Tyler frowned. "No way." He adjusted quickly and fired again. Another sharp crack rolled through the dry air. Again the spotters searched. Again the steel stayed silent. "Low right," another Marine called out. Tyler cursed under his breath and lowered the rifle. Sweat rolled along the side of his neck, now despite the dry heat. Wind shifted. Somebody muttered nearby. Dean said nothing. He simply stood behind the firing line, watching the canyon below. The grass near the ravine bent softly one direction, while dust higher along the ridge drifted another. Triple layers. Hidden movement. Invisible roads inside the air itself. Mercer stepped beside Tyler, checking the ballistic tablet clipped to his vest. Your data is clean, he said quietly. Elevation is right. Tyler shook his head in frustration. Then why is the drift all over the place? Dean answered before Mercer could. Because the canyon is lying to you. Several Marines looked toward him again. Tyler laughed once, but there was irritation in it now instead of confidence. You keep saying that like it means something. Dean slowly walked toward the firing mat, old boots scraping softly against gravel. The range felt quieter with each step. He lowered himself carefully onto one knee behind the old M40, movements practiced and economical despite his age. The rifle settled naturally into his shoulder like it belonged there. Dean did not immediately look through the scope. Instead, he watched the canyon itself. The heat, the grass, the shimmer, the distant mirage boiling across the rock face nearly a mile away. Tyler folded his arms tightly. You seriously think that antique can hit farther than this? Dean rested one finger gently against the rifle stock. The rifle is not the problem. Mercer crossed his arms beside the firing line. Then what is? Dean finally leaned down behind the scope. The shooter. A few Marines exchanged uncomfortable looks at that. Tyler smirked again, but weaker this time. The old veteran's calm was starting to wear on everyone. Dean adjusted nothing on the rifle for several long seconds. No frantic dialing. No checking charts. No ballistic calculations glowing on screens. Just stillness. Then he reached forward and turned the scope turret only slightly. Barely enough to notice. Mercer frowned immediately. That correction is wrong, he said. At this distance you are overcompensating nearly 6 inches. Dean never looked away from the target. No, he said softly. I am compensating for where the wind is going. The canyon suddenly fell quiet except for the low howl of air moving through stone. Somewhere overhead, the distant hum of a helicopter drifted across the sky again. Dean exhaled slowly. Half a breath. Then stillness. His finger tightened gently against the trigger. The old M40 thundered across the firing range once more, and every Marine immediately leaned toward the spotting scopes waiting for the steel plate to ring. The echo of the shot rolled away into the canyon and disappeared. Every Marine on the firing line leaned toward the spotting scopes waiting for the steel plate to move, waiting for the sharp metallic ring that never came. The target remained perfectly still beneath the brutal Nevada sun. No impact, no dust, no movement at all. Silence hung over the range for almost 3 full seconds before Tyler Quinn burst out laughing again. No way, he barked, slapping one hand against the shooting bench. He missed it twice. Several Marines joined in immediately, louder now than before. The tension broke all at once as grins spread across the line again. One of the younger shooters lowered his spotting scope, shaking his head. At 2,000 yards, he muttered. That round could have landed anywhere. Dean Callahan slowly lifted his face from the old scope. Calm, unbothered. The dry wind pulled softly at the collar of his faded jacket, while spent brass glimmered beside his knee in the dust. Staff Sergeant Mercer exhaled hard through his nose and glanced toward the untouched target plate shimmering far across the canyon. No impact confirmed, he announced flatly. Again. Tyler smirked immediately. Guessed the canyon lied to him too. More laughter rolled across the firing line. One Marine behind the benches was still filming with his phone now, quietly narrating between chuckles as though the entire thing had become entertainment. Dean worked the bolt of the M40 slowly. Smooth metal sliding against worn steel. Familiar. Controlled. Then he stood carefully from the mat and slung the rifle over one shoulder. Mercer watched him closely now. Something about the old man's expression bothered him. There was no frustration. No embarrassment. No disappointment. Dean looked exactly the same as he had before the shot. Tyler spread his arms dramatically. So where do you think that one went? He asked loudly. California. A few Marines laughed harder at that. Dean finally turned his eyes toward him. Pale blue. Clear. Still steady despite the decades behind them. You boys keep looking at the target, he said quietly. That is your problem. Tyler rolled his eyes. You did not hit the target. Dean nodded once. I know. Mercer frowned immediately at that answer. Then what exactly are you trying to say? Dean looked back toward the canyon. Heat shimmer twisted the air above the distant steel plate until the entire range looked fluid and unreal. The old veteran studied it silently for a few seconds before speaking again. "You check the front," he said. The words landed strangely against the noise of the firing line. Several Marines exchanged confused looks. Tyler frowned. "What does that even mean?" Dean never answered him. Instead, he slowly reached down and brushed dust from the old walnut stock. His fingers paused briefly over the long gouge near the bolt assembly again. Mercer noticed it this time. The scar in the wood looked deep, violent, old enough to belong to another lifetime. The staff sergeant narrowed his eyes slightly. "You think the round passed through?" he asked. Tyler laughed instantly. "Through what?" "Air." But Mercer was no longer smiling. He stared downrange again, squinting against the heat waves boiling above the canyon floor. The target plate did look untouched, completely untouched. Still, something gnawed quietly at the back of his mind now. Dean had corrected for conditions nobody else even noticed. And despite the public humiliation, despite the laughter, the old man had not defended himself once. Mercer slowly reached for the spotting scope again. He studied the target longer this time. Then his expression changed slightly, barely noticeable. "Hold on," he muttered. Tyler looked over. "What?" Mercer lowered the scope slowly. "The frame behind the plate," he said quietly. "I cannot see it clearly from here." The firing line began to settle into silence again as Mercer stared toward the distant target. Then, without another word, he grabbed a pair of binoculars and started walking downrange alone through the swirling Nevada dust. The firing line stayed unusually quiet as Staff Sergeant Mercer disappeared down the dusty service trail leading toward the distant steel targets. The laughter from earlier had faded into scattered murmurs now, uncertain and restrained beneath the endless howl of wind moving through the canyon. Tyler Quinn leaned against the shooting bench with forced confidence, but his grin no longer carried the same energy. Something about the old veteran's calm refusal to explain himself had begun to crawl under everyone's skin. Dean Callahan remained near the firing mat beside the old M40, one weathered hand resting lightly across the walnut stock. He looked neither proud nor defensive. He simply watched the canyon. Heat waves twisted above the rock formations nearly a mile away, turning the distant target line into a watery blur. The smell of hot dust and gun oil drifted through the dry afternoon air. Somewhere overhead, the low rumble of helicopter rotors echoed faintly across the mountains. Tyler finally broke the silence. "You really expect anybody to believe that story?" he asked loudly. Dean never looked at him. "What story?" Tyler scoffed. "That you somehow threaded a shot through the target without touching it." A few Marines chuckled weakly behind him, but nobody laughed hard this time. Dean slowly lowered himself onto an empty ammo crate beside the firing line. His knees moved stiffly now, age showing itself in quiet ways. He rested both hands atop the old rifle and stared out toward the canyon below. "Wind does strange things in deep rock," he said calmly. Tyler rolled his eyes. "Bullets do not disappear." Dean's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly against the sunlight. "No," he agreed softly. "They do not." One of the younger Marines, near the spotting scopes, shifted uneasily. His name tape read Brooks. Barely 20 years old. Quiet compared to the others. He kept studying the canyon through his optic even after Mercer vanished downrange. "Something is weird," Brooks muttered under his breath. Tyler glanced toward him immediately. "What?" Brooks hesitated. "I never saw a dust trail." Tyler frowned. "So?" Brooks lowered the spotting scope slowly. "At that distance? With that angle? If he missed clean, we should have seen dust kick somewhere behind the berm." The firing line went still again. Tyler looked annoyed now more than confident. "Maybe you blinked." Brooks shook his head. "No, I was tracking the entire flight." Dean quietly closed his eyes for one brief moment as the wind swept harder across the canyon floor. The sound carried him somewhere else for an instant. Somewhere wet, green, ancient. The dry Nevada air vanished beneath the phantom memory of jungle humidity thick enough to taste. Rotor blades thundered overhead through heavy rain. Young hands gripped the same rifle decades earlier, knuckles slick with mud, while distant voices crackled through broken radio static. The gouge in the walnut stock had not existed then. Not yet. Dean remembered the exact second it appeared. A sharp impact against stone beside his firing position deep in the mountains west of Da Nang. The rifle slammed hard against shattered rock, while crosswinds screamed through the valley below. A younger staff sergeant beside him had stared through binoculars in disbelief after the impossible shot landed nearly a mile away through layered jungle fog. "Nobody is going to believe that," the young Marine had whispered. Dean opened his eyes again. Nevada sunlight replaced jungle rain instantly. The firing line returned around him. Gravel, dust, heat. Tyler Quinn watching him with growing irritation. Then suddenly, far downrange, a tiny figure appeared near the steel targets. Mercer. Even at this distance, something about the staff sergeant's posture looked different now. Slower. No binoculars raised anymore. He stood frozen beside the target line for several long seconds without moving at all. Brooks noticed first. Why did he stop? Nobody answered. The wind howled harder through the canyon as every Marine on the firing line stared toward the distant figure standing motionless beside the steel plate. The desert wind screamed through the canyon hard enough to rattle the loose brass scattered across the firing line. Nobody spoke as Staff Sergeant Mercer remained frozen beside the distant target, stand nearly 2,000 yards away. Even from that distance, the Marines could tell something had changed. His posture had lost its confidence. Tyler Quinn narrowed his eyes against the heat shimmer. "What is he doing?" he muttered. Brooks never lowered his spotting scope. "I think he found something." Dean Callahan sat quietly beside the old M40 with both hands resting atop the worn walnut stock. Calm, motionless, the same expression he had carried since the first shot. Around him, the younger Marines shifted uneasily now, glancing between the distant range officer and the old veteran sitting among them like a ghost from another era. The silence itself was becoming uncomfortable. Tyler forced a laugh that sounded thinner than before, probably checking for ricochet marks. Nobody answered him. The dry air carried only the low whistle of wind moving through stone and scrub brush. Then Mercer finally moved again. He crouched near the target frame, disappearing briefly behind the steel silhouette. A long moment passed. Then another. Brooks slowly lowered his spotting scope, his face pale beneath the desert heat. "Oh my God," he whispered. Tyler looked at him sharply. "What?" Brooks swallowed hard. "There is a hole behind the plate." The firing line went completely silent. Tyler blinked once. "What are you talking about?" Brooks pointed toward the canyon with shaking fingers. "The support column behind the target." Mercer is looking right at it. Every Marine turned back toward the distant figure near the steel stand. Mercer stood slowly now, but he did not move away from the target. Instead, he reached one hand toward the rear support beam and simply stared at it. Dean finally lifted the old rifle from his lap and began wiping dust from the scope with a faded cloth pulled from his jacket pocket. Tyler laughed once more, but now it sounded forced. "Defensive." "No," he said quickly. "That does not mean anything. Maybe another shooter hit it before." Dean spoke without looking up. "At 2,000 yards?" Tyler opened his mouth, but no words came out. The canyon suddenly felt much larger than before, colder somehow despite the heat. Mercer finally started walking back toward the firing line. Slow steps through swirling dust. No radio call. No shouting. Just silence. The Marines watched him carefully now. Brooks shifted beside the spotting bench. "Sir?" he called uncertainly as Mercer approached. The staff sergeant ignored him completely. His eyes remained locked on Dean Callahan the entire walk back. Something heavy had settled into Mercer's expression. Not excitement. Not anger. Recognition. When he finally reached the firing line again, nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Tyler Quinn looked unsure now. Mercer stopped directly in front of Dean. The wind tugged hard at both men's jackets while dust swirled around their boots. Then Mercer slowly held up one hand. Resting in his palm was a jagged piece of painted steel freshly broken from the rear support column behind the target. A perfect circular hole sat directly through the center of it. Clean. Precise. Tyler stared at it blankly. "That is impossible," he whispered. Mercer looked down at the damaged steel again before answering quietly. The round passed through the center edge of the target plate, so clean the spotters never saw the impact. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly anymore. Mercer slowly turned the steel fragment in his hand. The edges around the hole were smooth, surgical, like machinery instead of gunfire. Then his eyes drifted toward the old M40 resting across Dean's lap, toward the deep gouge carved into the walnut stock near the bolt. Mercer frowned slightly. "That rifle," he said carefully. Where did you get it? Dean looked out toward the canyon again as the wind bent the grass in 3 separate directions below the ridge line. I did not get it, he said softly. They gave it back. The firing line stayed completely silent after Dean Callahan's words settled into the desert air. They gave it back. The sentence hung there heavier than anyone expected. Tyler Quinn stared at the old rifle resting across the veteran's lap as though seeing it for the first time. The worn walnut stock no longer looked outdated. It looked survived. Staff Sergeant Mercer slowly crouched beside the firing bench, still holding the broken steel fragment in one hand. Up close, the hole through the metal looked impossible. Clean edges. No deformation. No wild drift pattern. The shot had traveled exactly where Dean intended it to go. Mercer looked down at the gouge carved near the rifle's bolt assembly. The scar in the wood was dark with age, polished smooth around the edges from decades of handling. What happened there? He asked quietly. Dean ran his thumb once across the mark without speaking at first. The desert wind swept harder through the canyon, carrying dust across the benches and rattling loose brass along the concrete. Somewhere above the range, the faint chop of helicopter blades echoed against the mountains again. Dean finally answered. Stone Ridge west of Da Nang, he said softly. 1968. Several Marines exchanged uneasy glances. Even Tyler stayed silent now. Dean's eyes drifted somewhere beyond the firing range. Beyond Nevada. The years around him seemed to thin for a moment beneath the heat shimmer dancing across the canyon. The wind crossed 3 valleys before it reached us, Dean continued quietly. Nobody could figure out why the rounds kept drifting wrong. His fingers rested lightly against the old rifle stock. One shot mattered that day. The firing line remained frozen around him. No jokes now. No laughter. Only the low howl of wind through rock and scrub brush. Mercer studied the old veteran carefully. You were a sniper? Dean gave a small shrug. Sometimes. Tyler frowned immediately at that answer. Nobody shoots like that by accident. Dean looked toward the distant steel target again. Neither does the wind. Brooks shifted beside the spotting bench, unable to look away from the rifle. Sir, he asked carefully, how did you know the air would carry the round that far right? Dean pointed quietly toward the canyon floor. Heat rises off the black rock near the ravine, pushes the round left halfway through flight. Then he pointed toward the ridge line higher above the target. Crosswind up there pushes it back. His finger lowered slightly toward the grass below the target stand. But down low, the canyon folds inward, creates a reverse current. Mercer blinked slowly as the realization settled over him. 3 separate wind layers, he murmured. Dean nodded once. Most shooters fight the wind they can feel. Experienced shooters learn to trust the wind they cannot. Tyler stared downrange again, jaw tight now. The confidence that carried him earlier had drained away completely. He looked suddenly younger than before. Mercer slowly stood back up holding the broken steel fragment. That shot should not have been possible, he admitted quietly. Dean gave the faintest hint of a smile. Not pride, just memory. That is what they said in 68 too. The helicopter sound overhead grew louder suddenly. Several Marines glanced skyward as a dark military transport helicopter crossed above the canyon at low altitude, rotor wash kicking dust across the range. Dean barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed on the distant target line. Mercer looked between the helicopter and the old veteran, something uneasy growing behind his eyes now. Callahan, he said slowly. What unit were you with? Dean's expression changed almost invisibly. The smallest shift. Like an old door closing somewhere deep behind his eyes. He rested one hand across the rifle again. Most of it does not officially exist anymore, he said. Calmly. Tyler frowned. What does that mean? Dean never answered him. At that exact moment, the helicopter above the canyon suddenly banked hard toward the firing range instead of continuing past it. The helicopter swept low across the canyon with a deep mechanical thunder that rolled over the firing range like distant storm clouds. Dust exploded across the concrete benches as Marines instinctively turned their faces away from the rotor wash. The dark green aircraft banked hard once more, then descended directly toward the operations pad beside the range tower, instead of continuing toward the main base. Staff Sergeant Mercer stared upward, confusion tightening across his face. What is command doing out here? He muttered. Nobody answered. Dean Callahan remained seated beside the old M40, completely unmoved by the chaos around him. The rotor wash whipped through his gray hair and rattled the faded sling hanging from the rifle stock, but the old veteran never even looked toward the helicopter. His eyes stayed fixed on the canyon below as though he already knew why it had come. Tyler Quinn watched the aircraft settle onto the landing pad, with growing unease crawling across his face. "This has to be about the range violation," he said quietly. "No way somebody called this in over one shot." The helicopter touched down hard against the concrete, kicking spirals of dust into the burning afternoon air. A moment later, the side door slid open. Several officers stepped out first, moving quickly beneath the spinning rotors. Then another figure appeared behind them. Older, tall, broad-shouldered despite the years. The silver eagle insignia on his chest caught the sunlight immediately. Colonel Nathan Briggs. Every Marine on the firing line snapped instinctively to attention the second they recognized him. Briggs commanded the entire training installation. He almost never visited live fire ranges personally. The colonel walked through the blowing dust without hesitation, eyes locked directly on Dean Callahan from the moment he stepped off the helicopter. Mercer immediately straightened beside the firing benches. "Colonel on deck," he barked. The range fell silent except for the fading whine of the rotor blades overhead. Briggs ignored everyone else completely. He crossed the firing line with long, deliberate strides until he stopped only a few feet from the old veteran sitting beside the worn M40 rifle. Nobody moved. Tyler Quinn felt his throat tighten suddenly. The colonel's expression looked wrong. Not angry, not confused. Something else. Recognition. Briggs slowly lowered his gaze toward the rifle resting across Dean's lap, toward the deep gouge carved into the walnut stock. The color drained from his face almost instantly. "No," he whispered under his breath. Dean finally looked up at him calmly. "Afternoon, Nathan." Several Marines exchanged stunned looks immediately. Nobody addressed Colonel Briggs by his first name. Nobody. Briggs stared at the old veteran for several long seconds while the Nevada wind screamed across the canyon behind them. Then, to the complete shock of everyone on the firing line, the colonel slowly removed his cover and stood perfectly still before the seated old man. "I heard there was a 2,000-yard pass-through on Range 7, Briggs said quietly. Dean gave a faint shrug. Wind lined up. Briggs let out a soft breath that sounded almost like disbelief. His eyes drifted once more toward the gouge on the rifle stock. "I saw that rifle once before," he murmured. "When I was 19. Tyler Quinn blinked hard. Mercer stared silently between the two men now, piecing things together. Briggs finally looked back toward the Marines gathered around the firing benches. "Do any of you know who this man is?" Nobody answered. Dean looked mildly irritated by the question itself. Briggs nodded slowly as though he expected that. Then the colonel looked back down at the old veteran and spoke with a level of respect none of the younger Marines had ever heard from him before. "Ghost wind," he said quietly. The firing line froze. Even the wind itself seemed to disappear for one impossible second. Brooks frowned first. "Ghost wind." Mercer's eyes widened instantly. He turned toward Dean with visible disbelief. "That was not real," he whispered. Briggs looked at him sharply. "That is what command told the newspapers." Dean sighed softly beside the old rifle. "Nathan," he muttered, "I came here to watch boys shoot, not dig up ghosts." The canyon stayed silent after Colonel Briggs spoke the name. "Ghost wind." Nobody on the firing line moved. Tyler Quinn stared at Dean Callahan as though the old veteran had suddenly become someone else entirely. Brooks slowly lowered his spotting scope onto the bench without taking his eyes off the man beside the worn M40. Even the dry Nevada wind seemed quieter now, sweeping dust softly across the concrete instead of howling through the range like before. Dean looked mildly uncomfortable beneath the attention gathering around him. "Nathan," he said quietly. "That name should have stayed buried." Colonel Briggs shook his head once. "Maybe," he answered, "but not after that shot." He turned slowly toward the Marines standing frozen behind the firing benches. "Most of what happened in the Western Valleys during '68 never officially existed," Briggs said calmly. "Small recon teams. Impossible terrain. Wind conditions nobody could calculate." His eyes drifted toward the distant steel target still shimmering nearly 2,000 yards away. One sniper changed how the Corps trained long-range shooters after that deployment. Tyler frowned slightly. That was him. Briggs looked directly at him. The stories were classified for years. Half the instructors who taught modern wind compensation built their methods from reports connected to one call sign. Dean sighed softly beside the rifle. Stories get bigger over time. Briggs gave the faintest smile. Not that one. The Marines remained completely silent now. No jokes. No smirks. Only the quiet scrape of boots shifting against gravel as the truth settled heavier across the firing line. Tyler glanced toward the broken steel fragment still resting in Mercer's hand. Suddenly, the impossible hole through the metal no longer felt impossible at all. Mercer slowly stepped toward Dean and carefully held the damaged steel piece out to him. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Dean looked at the younger staff sergeant for a moment before gently pushing the steel fragment back toward him. "No," he answered calmly. "You owe your shooters better wind training." A few Marines lowered their heads at that. Not from humiliation anymore. From respect. Briggs glanced toward the old M40 resting across Dean's lap. "You still read air better than computers," he said. Dean rested one hand along the worn walnut stock again. "Computers only know numbers," he replied softly. "Wind has memory." The colonel nodded slowly as though he understood exactly what that meant. Tyler Quinn suddenly stepped forward from behind the firing benches, his earlier arrogance completely gone now. He looked embarrassed. Younger somehow. "Sir," he said awkwardly, "I should not have laughed." Dean looked at him for a long second. Then he slowly stood, lifting the old rifle carefully into his hands. The desert sun cast long shadows across the firing range now, as evening slowly approached over the canyon walls. "Every young Marine laughs before the wind humbles him," Dean said quietly. Tyler swallowed hard, but nodded once. Dean adjusted the faded sling over his shoulder and started walking slowly toward the parking lot beyond the range tower. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. Marines simply watched him go beneath the fading Nevada sunlight, while dust rolled softly across the empty firing line. Halfway to the gate, Dean paused briefly without turning around. "Stop aiming where the target is," he said calmly. "Aim where the air carries the truth." Then he kept walking. Colonel Briggs remained standing beside the firing benches long after the old veteran disappeared beyond the range road. Around him, young Marines stared silently toward the canyon below, where the wind bent the grass in 3 separate directions at once. And for the first time all day, every one of them finally understood what they were really looking at. Some legends are not remembered because they were loud. They are remembered because nobody else could do what they did.